in general, I think there are three basic positions. There's physicalism, there's idealism, and then I like to put panpsychism kind of in between here. Now, physicalism, also sometimes it's referred to as materialism, can come in different forms, right? I like to think of the different varieties of physicalism in terms of the stance that physicalists take on the question of emergence. In a lot of the literature, a distinction is made between so-called strong emergence and weak emergence. Sometimes this distinction could be construed as the strong emergence is ontological emergence, whereas the weak emergence is epistemological emergence. And the difference here is that for the physicalists who think that consciousness is strongly emergent, what they're suggesting is that there's a kind of downward causation, like our experience of agency is real and can affect the body, right? So there's some physicalists who claim that consciousness is strongly emergent. But to my mind, what this ends up looking like is a kind of dualism, right? Because you've got mental causation, which we experience directly in our own willpower and agency, and then you've got physical causation, which is apparently how the rest of nature works without consciousness. And so, to my mind, strong emergence leaves us with a kind of dualistic ontology with downward mental causation and bottom-up physical causation, and it's not exactly clear how the two would relate. Weak emergence, on the other hand, amounts to a kind of epiphenomenalism, which does not grant consciousness any causal power, right? As T.H. Huxley put it a century ago, the epiphenomenalist position on consciousness is like saying consciousness amounts to nothing more than the whistle on a train, right? It's not driving the train, it's just a side effect of the mechanics that are powering the train. And so while we are aware and have this experiential horizon that somehow emerges from brain activity, for weak emergentists, that consciousness has no causal influence over our behavior whatsoever, right? And the reason I would distinguish these two as strong emergence being ontological emergence and weak emergence being epistemological emergence is that strong emergentists are saying that a new kind of being appears when, neurons become complex in their relationships. A new kind of being called consciousness emerges that wasn't present in nature before, and so it's ontologically distinct from what preceded it. Whereas weak emergentists, they tend to say that it's not a new kind of being which emerges, it's just that we can't really know, we're limited as conscious beings in our capacity to know how consciousness could emerge or to know how consciousness is related to nature. Sometimes this position is called Mysterianism, where you just sort of have to accept that we are, as conscious beings, constitutively unable to understand ourselves, right? There's just a limit to our knowledge here. And then there's another form of physicalism, the more extreme form, called eliminative materialism. And I think in terms of logical consistency and rigor, this is actually the superior position in that it doesn't require us to create a new domain of being like the dualistic strong emergentists do, and it doesn't require us to construe conscious experience as a sort of epiphenomenal illusion. We just accept eliminative materialists like Patricia and Paul Churchland or Daniel Dennett, though he doesn't like to be called an eliminativist. I think it's hard to see how his position doesn't amount to that. For them, we have a word called consciousness or mind. We have words for emotions and different mental states. But really, this is just a function of our language and useful ways of speaking. And the Churchlands in particular think that as science advances and we understand the brain better, we'll gradually do away with these words, just like science did away with phlogiston and the ether and so on. We won't talk about consciousness anymore. We'll talk in terms of neurophysiology. So while I don't agree with this position, I think it's more consistent with the premises of a physicalist ontology, right? I want to say one more thing about the physicalist emergentist account of consciousness, and that is that if you are a weak emergentist and you think consciousness is epiphenomenal, right? It has no influence over our behavior, then it becomes impossible to give an evolutionary account of the emergence of consciousness. Because for consciousness to be selected for through a Darwinian process of evolution, right, it would need to be influencing the behavior of the organisms which possess it, or which are possessed by it, however you want to look at it. If consciousness has no causal influence over the behavior of organisms, then it can't evolve, right? And so the epiphenomenalist has that problem with their position, among others. Let's move on to panpsychism then. There are also a variety of panpsychisms. The main distinction I would want to draw is between substance property panpsychisms and process relational panpsychisms. So for substance property panpsychists, like Philip Goff, for example, he's written a great book called Galileo's Error, where he articulates the error that he thinks Galileo made by separating primary and secondary characteristics in an attempt to inaugurate the new scientific method, which would focus only on the primary characteristics of nature, right, the measurable, mathematizable features of the natural world, while saying that the secondary characteristics, all of the qualities, colors and scents and tastes and so on, for Galileo, those aren't part of nature, right? And this is you could say a useful method, but Goff worries that when it becomes a metaphysics or an understanding of the nature of reality, it leads us into all sorts of paradoxes. And he thinks panpsychism resolves this, but he construes panpsychism in the context of a substance ontology, where consciousness becomes an intrinsic property of matter, right? So Goff will say that physics studies the extrinsic properties of matter. Consciousness is the intrinsic property of matter. It doesn't show up to the methods that the physicists use to measure the mass and motion of material particles. But when we ask what is matter, Goff's answer is, well, it is consciousness. Now, Goff's position as a substance property panpsychist has shifted over the years, and so among the substance property variety of panpsychism, there's also some subsets here. The first would be constitutive micropsychism, right, is how this gets construed in the literature, which is the idea that human consciousness or animal consciousness is not fundamental. It's actually built up of micro consciousnesses, which in some way sum to the higher level consciousness that human beings and other animals possess, right? So this is constitutive micropsychism, and some would claim that you run into the combination problem with this particular form of panpsychism, and we'll spend some time on that in another module later this semester. Another form would be emergentist panpsychism. And here, the approach here would be to say that there are genuine emergent levels of consciousness, and human consciousness is just as real as the micro-consciousness that particles might have. And so there's no reductionistic understanding of, even panpsychists can be reductionistic in the sense that they think human consciousness is fundamentally made up of smaller micro-consciousnesses. The emergent panpsychists would say, no, each emergent level of consciousness is just as real as the others, and indeed has causal influence in a top-down way. Constitutive micropsychism often doesn't admit any sort of free will, right? There's no causal agency at the level of human consciousness. Everything is reducible to the micro consciousnesses of which we are made, right? So the emergent panpsychist says, no, each combination of smaller forms of consciousness into larger forms of consciousness also has causal power, right? And then the final form of substance property panpsychism that I would demarcate here would be called Cosmopsychism. And here the idea is that rather than trying to build up our human kind of consciousness from the bottom, consciousness is actually derived from the cosmic consciousness, and our human consciousness is a sort of partial view or an aspect of that larger consciousness. So if any of you are familiar with the philosopher Baruch Spinoza, I see even though cosmopsychists are not necessarily pantheists in that they're saying that this cosmic consciousness is God. It's hard not to draw the comparison here, right? Because for Spinoza, there is really one infinite substance, and we as finite minds are a mode of that one infinite substance. And as modes, our finite experience is in some way a kind of illusion, and what's really real is the one cosmic mind. So that's cosmopsychism. Process relational panpsychism is Whitehead's position, right? Which is neither bottom up nor top down, in that it's rejecting the whole idea of substance as a fundamental building block, as the micropsychists think, or as an account of the cosmos as a whole. For Whitehead, even the cosmos as a whole is an ongoing process, right? The cosmos is never the same in any two given moments. It's constantly growing beyond its prior situation with each new drop of experience, right? So we're going to spend a lot of time unpacking the implications of this process relational form of panpsychism, so I'm not going to say too much about it here. And finally, there's idealism, which also comes in several varieties, the first of which I would characterize as the transcendental variety. And here I'm thinking in particular of Immanuel Kant, for whom transcendental idealism would be this position whereby mind is sort of assumed in the way that Descartes did as the epistemic primary, and Kant's whole transcendental project was to elaborate the categorical structure of mind and the forms of our intuition of space and time, and show how all of our experience is in some way constructed by these categories and intuitions. And for Kant, the transcendental idealist position says that we can't know reality in itself. We can't know the things in themselves, right? And so the idealism here is of a transcendental sort in that it's not claiming to be an account of reality in itself. It's really an account of the form of our own knowing, right? The limitations of our own mental operations. There's also a sort of spin-off of the Kantian approach, which I would call phenomenological idealism. And it's very similar to Kant's approach. Here I think of 20th century philosophers like Husserl and Heidegger and Merleau-Ponty, and especially with Maurice Merleau-Ponty's later work, it becomes more embodied and it becomes an account of experience that doesn't necessarily divide the mind from the rest of reality, but sort of brackets ontological questions and just describes the nature of experience. So this is similar to Kant's, but I think different enough to distinguish it, and we will have occasion to look at the phenomenological approach to the study of consciousness this semester. And then finally, there's absolute or non-dual idealism, which in the Western context would be associated with someone like Hegel. In the Eastern context, Advaita Vedanta would be a great example of this non-dual understanding, where in some way consciousness is considered to be fundamental, but it's a consciousness without an other, consciousness without any division between mind and body, right? Just pure consciousness as a kind of space in which all things occur. And I think I know several of you are very interested in this non-dual form of idealism. And it may be that this semester we end up having a lot of dialogue about the merits of panpsychism versus absolute or non-dual idealism in the ways that they attempt to shed new light on the nature of consciousness. So that's the situation as I understand it, but there's the map is not the territory, and I'm sure you all have more to add